प्लीज़ जितना जल्दी हो सके आप लोग जुड़ जाइए। लाइव क्लास है वो भेज दिए हैं, आपको लिंक भेज दिया गया है, तो प्लीज़ जितना जल्दी हो सके आप उतना ही जल्दी जुड़ जाइए जल्दी से, प्लीज़ लेट मत करिए। और अपना रेनबो इंग्लिश ज़रूर खोल लीजिए जल्दी से। जितना जल्दी हो सके प्लीज़ आप लोग जुड़ जाइए, उतना जल्दी हम क्लास को शुरू कर पाएंगे। और जल्दी से अपने दोस्तों को बोलिए जो नहीं जुड़ा हुआ है कि जल्दी से ही जुड़ जाए वो, ताकि लाइव क्लास का समय बर्बाद ज़्यादा नहीं हो। जल्दी से प्लीज़। और आज जो मैं आपको चैप्टर का रीडिंग कराऊंगा उसका नाम है आपको दी अर्थ। चैप्टर नंबर 9 दी अर्थ, जो कि आपकी 12वीं का सिलेबस है। तो प्लीज स्टूडेंट्स जल्दी से आप लोग जुड़ जाएं। अगर आपको बी हीरो ऑफ इंग्लिश क्लासेज का ये वीडियो क्लास बड़ा अच्छा लग रहा हो तो प्लीज़ आप चैनल को सब्सक्राइब करें और लाइक भी ज़रूर करें, हो सके तो कमेंट भी करें। दिखेगा बुआ, क्वालिटी बढ़ा लो। अब हम क्लास को शुरू करेंगे क्योंकि 16 बच्चे जुड़ चुके हैं और आप तो खुद भी जानते हो कि सारे विद्यार्थी जुड़ता ही नहीं है, सब तो नेट उठ खा के बैठा रहता है सवेरे सवेरे। तो चलिए स्टूडेंट बुक खोल लीजिए आप लोग। अरे माइक कहाँ है? हाँ तो थोड़ा सा मैं माइक लगा लूं, तब तक आप लोग जुड़ जाइए। तब तक मैं माइक भी सेट कर लूं ताकि आपको आवाज जाने में किसी प्रकार का दिक्कत का सामना ना करना पड़े। चलिए माइक भी सेट कर ले रहा हूं मैं और फिर हम लोग रीडिंग क्लास को शुरू करेंगे। अभी रीडिंग सीखना आपके लिए बहुत ही जरूरी है, इसीलिए प्लीज क्लास को मजाक बनाने से कोई फायदा नहीं है। तो आइए स्टूडेंट्स, आप जो है ये जो देख पा रहे हैं स्क्रीन पे रेनबो 2, इसे आप खोल लीजिए और मैं पेज नंबर बता दे रहा हूं आपको, क्योंकि जो भी हार्ड चैप्टर है डायरेक्ट में अगर उसका आपको उच्चारण सिखाऊं तो हो सकता है कि आपको समझ में शायद नहीं भी आए, इसीलिए जो जो इजी चैप्टर है पहले मैं उसे ही ले रहा हूं और उसके बाद फिर भारी चैप्टर को भी लिया जाएगा जैसे आप सीखते जाओगे। तो चलिए स्टूडेंट्स आप लोग पेज नंबर 83 उल्टा लीजिए, 83 जल्दी से पेज नंबर 83 आप लोग उल्टा लीजिए, पेज नंबर 83 जिसके कि आपको लेफ्ट साइड मिलेगा दी अर्थ। जल्दी से प्लीज पेज नंबर 83 उल्टाइए। तो चलिए पेज नंबर 83, अब मैं क्लास को शुरू कर रहा हूं। उंगली रख रख कर आप ध्यान देंगे, आपको समझ में आती जाएगी बातें। चलिए तो सबसे पहले द अर्थ की दी अर्थ, तो अर्थ में वॉवेल साउंड है और वॉवेल साउंड होने की वजह से हम लोग उसे द अर्थ नहीं पढ़ेंगे, क्या पढ़ेंगे? दी अर्थ। दी अर्थ, जिसके की राइटर हैं आपको H.E. बेट्स। राइटर कौन है? H.E. बेट्स। दी अर्थ, जिसके राइटर हैं H.E. बेट्स। तो आइए स्टूडेंट्स, हम लोग क्लास को शुरू करते हैं। H.E. बेट्स 1905 मतलब 1905 में इनका जन्म हुआ है और 1974 में इनकी मौत हुई है। बॉर्न एट नॉर्थम्पटन, नॉर्थम्पटन जो कि जगह का नाम है, इन सेंट्रल इंग्लैंड, इन सेंट्रल इंग्लैंड, was well acquainted, was, अरे आवाज आ रहा है इधर, was well acquainted with the English countryside। अरे आवाज आ रहा है इधर, सुन नहीं रही हो? अरे मोबाइल नहीं सुन रही हो आप? इंग्लिश कंट्रीसाइड, especially the peasants who lived there. A well-known short story writer, he worked for some time as a journalist. His first novel was published. His first novel was published when he was only 21 years old. He wrote many short stories about airmen and their adventures based on his experiences in the Royal Air Force. His important works include Fair Stood the Wind for France, जो कि 1944 में रिलीज हुआ था, वह प्रकाशित हुआ था मार्केट में। द पर्पल प्लेन, द जकारांडा ट्री, द स्कारलेट स्वॉर्ड एंड द डार्लिंग बर्ड्स ऑफ मई, जो कि 1958 में पब्लिश हुआ था, प्रकाशित हुआ था। द प्रेजेंट शॉर्ट स्टोरी दी अर्थ सेट इन द English countryside is about a farmer Johnson and his son Benji, who appears to be a simple-minded person. The story very well depicts the laziness of the parents, and the growing selfishness, selfishness and cunningness, cunningness of their simple minded son who finally derives them away from their home, from their home। THEIR को हम लोग दियर पढ़ेंगे, जबकि THERE को देयर पढ़ेंगे। तो चलिए स्टूडेंट्स, इस चैप्टर की शुरुआत करते हैं। अभी जो हमने पढ़ा वो लेखक के बारे में परिचय दिया गया था, और ये चैप्टर किस बारे में दिया गया है उसके बारे में था। तो चलिए हम चैप्टर का लाइन लाइन तोड़ तोड़ के उसका उच्चारण सीखते हैं, एक्सप्लेनेशन सीखते हैं, और इसका हिंदी आपको क्लास में बताया जाएगा और बताया जा भी रहा है। तो चलिए रीडिंग क्लास के इस एक और प्रयास को हम लोग जारी करते हैं। तो चलिए डियर स्टूडेंट्स, लेट अस स्टार्ट द रीडिंग क्लास नाउ। स्टेंजा नंबर 1 का आ रहा है आपका, all that the Johnsons had was the earth. All that the Johnsons had was the earth, the earth नहीं, the earth। very often या obtain भी आप पढ़ सकते हैं। very often it seemed as if it were all they had ever had। क्लियर है? एक बार पूरा का उच्चारण देखिए थोड़ा सा फर्स्ट में। all that the Johnsons had was the earth. very often it seems as if it all they had ever had। क्लियर है? तो देखिए, it was true that they also had possessions, a plow, a two-wheeled cart, tools, a bony brown mare, which slowly dragged the plow and the cart about their rough 4-acre plot, but without the earth, these things were useless. These things were useless. It was true that they also had a son। स्टेंजा नंबर 3 देखिए, the Johnsons' son was named Benji। The Johnsons' son was named Benji, and it was more than 30 years since they had surrendered to the idea that he was not right in his head. It was not that he was insane माना पागल, insane, और imbecile मीन्स भी पागल, अधकपाड़ी, imbecile, or even that he could not read and write and count figures, but only that he was simple, not quite like other people, not quite like other people, and because he was their only son, and because he was their only son, the Johnson had spent many years being a little too kind, too anxious, and too sacrificial, and too sacrificial, too sacrificial towards him, towards him, so that he had grown up, he had grown up to seem worse, to seem worse in their eyes, in their eyes than he really was, than he really was. Benji had the large loose limbs. Benji had the large loose limbs that often belong to the simple minded, belong to the simple minded, and thick, soft, fair hair on his face, fair hair on his face. He had the look of being a simple hearted man as well as a simple minded man. His eyes were blue. His eyes were blue, and all day long he had a simple smile on his face. But somewhere behind the blue eyes, the simple smile and the soft childish and the soft childish hair, his simplicity seemed gradually to have become a kind of cunning, become a kind of cunning, become a kind of cunning. तो स्टूडेंट्स जो देर से जुड़े हैं उसे मैं बता दूं कि अभी मैं 12वीं का जो रेनबो इंग्लिश 2 है उसमें पेज नंबर 83 में 83 नंबर पेज का स्टेंजा नंबर 4 स्टार्ट करने जा रहा हूं। पेज नंबर 83, स्टेंजा नंबर 4, और चैप्टर का नाम है दी अर्थ। जो लेट से जुड़े हैं देखिए चैप्टर नंबर 9 का 83 पेज और स्टेंजा नंबर 4। It was more than 30 years since the Johnsons realizing that he was not quite like others. He was not quite like others. Had taken Benji to a doctor. Had taken Benji to a doctor. This doctor had persuaded, persuaded them that he needed interests that would strengthen his mind. It would be good, वुड पढ़िएगा, WOULD को वुड पढ़िएगा, इसे आप वुल्ड नहीं पढ़िएगा, वुड. It would be good if they gave him something to do, some occupation which would help his development, It would help a great deal, if they gave him a special interest to feed his sense of responsibility. You are people on the land, the doctor said. Let him keep hands. अब चलिए स्टेंजा नंबर 5 में. So for many years Benji had kept hands, and what the earth was to his mother and father, the hands were to Benji. They were almost all he had. अब पूजा कहाँ हो जी? They were almost all he had. When he came from school, cut off by his simplicity, from other children, Benji went straight home to his hands. अभी मैं आपको 83 स्टेंजा, मतलब ये पेज नंबर 83 स्टेंजा नंबर 5 को पढ़ा रहा हूं. Which he kept in a wire coop, that his father had made at the back of the house. His father had made at the back of the house. At first, he kept 10 or dozen hens. Dozen means dozen. All colors and breeds. Brown and speckled and black and white, and the coop was small, He fed the hens simply on scraps, scraps from the table, seeded cabbages strung from the wire, a little maize, and on corn ears, which he gleaned, which he gleaned in the late summer, in the late summer, in the late summer, from his father's acres of his father's acre of stubble. It is possible that a hen, being a simple creature, thrives based on simple treatment, Benji understood the first and last thing about a hen, that it exists for the purpose of laying eggs. In those days, this simple process had not become scientific, nor had it become highly complicated and commercialized. Eggs were cheap, hence mysteriously packed nourishment of the bare earth. They sat in a homemade nesting box on straw and laid the eggs expected of them. थोड़ा रुकिए, पानी पी लेते हैं थोड़ा सा, आप लोग भी पी लो. उम्मीद करता हूँ कि आपका भी जो है प्यास बुझ गया होगा पानी की वजह से, है ना. खैर छोड़िए, एनीवे लीव इट. 6 में देखिए, बेंजी अंडरस्टूड अनदर थिंग अबाउट द बिजनेस ऑफ हैंड्स, and that was that eggs could be sold to callers at the back door of their house in escorts and half escorts and fevers, and the money from these eggs was put carefully, almost religiously into a large white basin that stood on the top shelf of the kitchen of the kitchen cupboard. The basin was beyond. The basin was beyond Benji's reach. The basin was beyond Benji's reach. But one day his mother would tell him, the money will be yours. The money will be yours. You understand? You understand? You understand? Your father and me are going to save the money when there is enough. पेज उल्टाइए, अब पेज नंबर 84 में आइए। अब हम लोग, बहुत लंबा चैप्टर है, अब हम लोग पेज नंबर अब हम लोग अच्छा खासा लंबा पेज है। अब हम लोग 84 में देखते हैं। ख़त्म करना है आज, कुछ पाने के लिए कुछ खोना पड़ेगा, तो ध्यान दीजिए प्लीज़। We shall put it in the bank. We shall put it in the bank. The bank will give interest. The bank will give interest on it. On it. And then one day, when you are 21, it will be yours by rights. It will be yours by right. It will all be yours, and you can do what you like with it. Do you understand? Do you understand? Understand? And Benji would simply smile at his mother and say, yes, he understood. He understood. Understand का V2 है, understood। चलिए आगे 7वां स्टेंजा देखिए। As time went on, Benji began to keep many more hens. Soon there were more eggs than could be sold at the back door. At the back door. And by the time Benji had left school at 14, he had 40 or 50 hens. He had 40 or 50 hens and about as many laying pullets, and these were producing an average of 200 eggs a week. Soon he would set off 3 times a week with a large basket of eggs on a wheel truck and hawk them in Castard, the nearest town. By this time, the money no longer went into the basin, but straight into the bank. Benji could read, and a year or two afterwards, Afterwards, he read in a paper that it was better to segregate breeds of hens, breeds of hens, breeds of hens, keeping white leghorns, leghorns separate from horde islands and young from old. This meant new coops. This meant new coops, and at the same time, and at the same time, Benji read that hens needed air. Hens needed air and exercise and exercise and dry hygienic places to sleep. Places to sleep. Benji was very strong. Benji was very strong and understood a simple thing like nailing wire, knitting to wood, and began himself to build new houses and coops for the new segregated breeds of hens, segregated breeds of hens for all. पेज उल्टाइए. This he needed space. This he needed space, and so his father and mother gave him a strip of land running from the back of the house halfway across the field. In this way, they gave him something more precious than they had ever given before. For the first time, without fully realizing it, they gave him a piece of the earth. They gave him a piece of the earth. आठवां देखिए. All this time they themselves had struggled hard and almost vainly with the earth. At the back of their minds lay a precious belief that Benji would one day grow out of his simplicity. In the same way they cherished a silent belief that the earth would one day outgrow its poverty. आगे देखिए. The earth had yielded The earth had yielded stubbornly, stubbornly for them, and the reason, like Benji, was simple. Like Benji was simple. The reason was not in the earth, but in themselves. For most of their lives, they had put rather more value on faith than sweat. No, देखिए. For many years, Benji's father had been a local preacher, a local preacher, a man with quite a gift, quite a gift of talking, of talking. He liked not only to talk on Sundays to village congregations, congregations in small steel chapels, chapels for out in the countryside, but he liked to talk at the back door, even over the field gate, in the road outside the house. He talked so much that he must have had an idea that the earth designed, created, created, and nourished by God, and nourished by God, would take care of itself, would take care of itself. While he talked, while he talked, thistles, seeded, and chalked his wheat. Rabbits broke in and gnawed his cabbages, his cabbages. Storms smashed, storms smashed his standing corn, his standing corn. He struggled on like a man chained by bad luck, by bad luck. And while he knew that his land was poor, his land was poor, and that Benji was a simple man, no one had ever had the need or courage to tell him that he himself was a lazy man with too large a trust in providence, trust in providence, providence, providence. And while his father talked, Benji went on steadfastly, steadfastly with the simple business of making hens lay eggs, lay eggs. Part of the field at the back of his father's house began to resemble a covering checkerboard of black and brown and white feathers For a long time now, the eggs had been too many for the wheel truck. For the wheel truck, and Benji at the regular intervals borrowed his father's horse and cart, talking the eggs not only down into the town but also into market. All the time, Benji wore the simple smile on a simple-hearted man on his face, and all the time the money went religiously into the bank in his name. वाह, बहुत लंबा चैप्टर है, 2 दिन लगेगा। 11 ख़त्म कर लेते हैं हम लोग, तो 12 कल से पढ़ेंगे, या 12 या 13 भी ख़त्म कर लेंगे, देखते हैं जितना ख़त्म हो सके आज। When Benji was 21, his mother and father planned and carried out a little ceremony. They got his passbook from the bank, and at supper his father made a sort of a speech, almost in the tone of a public address, in which he talked as if he had been a diligent man all his life, setting an example of thrift and industry, and that the passbook was Benji's natural reward for following it. He talked as if he were talking to a child who still does not know 1 from 2. And at last he gave Benji the passbook. This is your money, Benji, he said. Now you are 21. This is your money. Do you understand? पेज उल्टाइए, 86 पेज नंबर 86, स्टेंजा नंबर 12। 13 खत्म कर लेंगे ना, फिर बाद में पढ़ेंगे। Yes, Benji said, and he took the passbook, he opened it and looked at it and saw in it an amount of more than 230 pounds. 230 pounds. Then he set up the passbook and put it into his pocket. 13 पढ़ लो, फिर कल पढ़ेंगे। 13 पढ़ लेते हैं। Benji's mother and father did not speak. A strange tremor of a peculiar emotion went through them both, a mixture of disappointment, a mixture of disappointment, fear, pride, and pain. The amount in Benji's passbook was more than they themselves had ever amassed from the earth in their lives. They did not hope and did not mean that Benji should give it back to them. But there was but there was something about the silent, simple finality of his putting the passbook into his pocket that struck them like a blow in the face. They had expected something else, a word of thanks, perhaps a concession, a willingness that they should share the money they had helped to save. It hurt them momentarily that Benji should appear so completely indifferent to them and to all they felt. Then they remembered why it was. Why it was. It was because Benji was still simple. There were sets of feeling and conduct that were beyond his understanding. They were touched with pity for him, and understood. 14 देखिए, what are you going to do with the money? They said. 14 कह रहा है कि what are you going to do with money? They said. 15 कह रहा है आपका I am going to buy a piece of land. I am going to buy a piece of land. Benji said. Lands? They said. What land? Where? Mr. Whitmore wants to sell the 4 acres next to us. Benji said. But Benji, they said, how did you know? How did you find out? Benji had a very simple answer. I asked Mr. Whitmore. He said, well, they said, that is very good idea. A wonderful good idea. You couldn't do anything better. As time went on and Benji acquired the land, his father and his mother not only felt that it was a good idea, but they felt very proud of him. They had that kind of pride in him that parents have in a child that says its first word or takes its first step. Benji, a simple-minded man, had taken his first step in normal adult things. It was wonderful too that he had taken the step without help, without force, or prompting all his life. They had him as a child that will not grow up, and now suddenly he had grown up. Through they could scarcely realize it. Benji was a man of property. Benji was a man of property. For the next 4 or 5 years, Benji went on creating more houses for more hands, and then selling more eggs and making more money. He was still a simple man. He could not have made a pair of boots. He knew nothing about the stock markets, but he knew everything about a hen. His hens were still to him what the earth was to his parents. All he had and all he understood. थोड़ा और पढ़ लो ना क्या। अब पेज नंबर 87 का आ रहा है आपका। चलिए 21 पढ़ के 24 पढ़ के गारंटी छोड़ देंगे। कह रहा है 24 कह रहा है there was only one difference between Benji's hens and his parents' land. The hens belonged to Benji. The land had never belonged to his parents, who had rented it now for 40 years. 24 पढ़ लो फिर छुट्टी हो जाएगा। On a yearly tenancy from a man named Sanders. They had often spoken of buying the lands, but somehow the scheme never came to anything. It was easier for Benji's father to stand at the door and talk, or to talk in the pulpit and trust in God, than to make a business proposition. And now at 65 they were too old to think of buying land नहीं है बुआ, यहाँ पे बाइंग के बाद LAND होना चाहिए, लेकिन गलती से N छूट गया है। इसमें N छूट गया ना तो इसका मतलब होगा लैड बना छोड़ा, LAD लैड बना छोड़ा होता है उसे, तो यहाँ पे N छूटा हुआ है। Even if there had been any money for buying land, तो 24 में टिक मार लीजिए। कल से हम लोग स्टेंजा नंबर 25 को शुरू करेंगे। याद रखिएगा स्टूडेंट्स, सिर्फ लाइव क्लास करने से नहीं होगा, या जो लाइव वीडियो है इसको मैं अभी यूट्यूब पर अपलोड कर रहा हूँ, आप खाना पीना खा के एक बार फिर से देखना, और बार बार देखोगे तो फिर दिक्कत नहीं रहेगा। क्योंकि कहावत है, करत करत अभ्यास त जरमति होत सुजान, रसरी आवत जात त सिल पर परत निशान। आप मंदिर जरूर गए होंगे, वहाँ आपने देखा होगा कि मंदिर में जो वो इनार जो होता है, तालाब जिसमें से हम पानी भर के भगवान को चढ़ाते हैं, उसमें आपने अक्सर देखा होगा कि पत्थर जो बना होता है चारों साइड से, शिला सीमेंट का बना होता है ना, लेकिन रस्सी के बार बार जाने से वो सीमेंट भी कट जाता है। मतलब वो हमको सीख देती है कि अगर हम बार बार लगातार मेहनत करके कोई काम करते रहे तो फिर हमें समस्याओं का सामना नहीं करना पड़ेगा और हम जीवन में आगे बढ़ जाएंगे, सफल बन जाएंगे। तो स्टूडेंट, हर एक चीज़ कोई न कोई सीख देती है हमें, और काबिल वही है, अच्छा स्टूडेंट वही है जो सीख को समझ बूझ के साथ पढ़े, लगातार मेहनत से जुड़े रहें। क्योंकि आपके टीचर कभी भी आपके लिए गलत बात नहीं कहेंगे अगर वो आपका अच्छा टीचर है तो याद रखिए, जो वीडियो बना हुआ है उसको बार बार रिवीजन करिए यूट्यूब से, कुछ तो मोबाइल का फ़ायदा उठा लो। और जब तक रीडिंग ठीक नहीं होगा आपका, तब तक कुछ नहीं होने वाला है। ओके स्टूडेंट्स, गॉड ब्लेस यू। आप इस वीडियो को आपने देखा, इसके लिए आपको बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद। गॉड ब्लेस यू। वैसे स्टूडेंट को भी शेयर करें वीडियो, जो स्टूडेंट को नहीं पता हो, कहीं भी पढ़ता हो, अगर उसको रीडिंग प्रॉब्लम दूर करना हो तो उसे ज़रूर बी हीरो ऑफ इंग्लिश क्लासेज के यूट्यूब चैनल पर शामिल करें। गॉड ब्लेस यू, बाय बाय, टेक केयर, गुड नाइट। और कल के क्लास में हम लोग ग्रामर पढ़ेंगे, तो कल ग्रामर का कॉपी लेके आप लोग आएंगे। मेहनत करिए, सब कुछ सही हो जाएगा। गॉड ब्लेस यू, टेक केयर।